The following video on Shadow of the Colossus contains spoilers for the entire game. If you haven't played it, then I highly recommend you do so before watching any further. I'd also recommend watching my video on Eco first if you've played both games. Shadow of the Colossus released in 2006 for the PlayStation 2. Unlike Eco, which released with little to no fanfare, Shadow of the Colossus was a more widely anticipated event, thanks to the reputation Team Eco had built up in the previous few years. The game opens with an introductory sequence primarily designed to acclimate the player to the atmosphere before the story really begins. After several dialogue-free minutes, this lengthy cutscene sets up the plot, which will remain almost entirely unchanged until the ending cutscene. The main character, who I'll be calling the Wanderer, sets out to revive Mono and makes a deal with Dorman to bring her back to life. All three of these characters are given very little backstory. Almost every piece of information given about them in this scene is crucial for the plot to work, with one notable exception being the reason for Mono's death. After this setup, Shadow of the Colossus falls into its repetitive structure, which will repeat for the rest of its duration. Unlike Eco, which dropped the player in with no guidance, Shadow of the Colossus features button prompts explaining basic actions to the player the first time they're required. It also has a short cliffside sequence which forces players to become familiar with the mechanics of climbing in a safe environment before the first Colossus. This very short tutorial is likely to be forgotten by the time the player finishes the game, but it does impact the aesthetic appeal of the opening sequences detrimentally, if only a little. This tutorial is well implemented, however, and wouldn't be noteworthy at all if not for the way it runs in opposition to Eco. While the tutorial is finished in a couple minutes, the heads-up display remains throughout. There was probably a lot of debate on the development team about including such an on-screen interface, and what the best way was to go about it. The grip gauge is such an integral part of the gameplay that it would need to be represented somehow. Without a depleting grip gauge, many sequences would lose their tension, and patient players would never fall off a Colossus. The health bar at the top of the screen is a much more questionable inclusion, however. Generally, the main benefit of a health bar on an enemy is to indicate that the player is inflicting damage with an attack, so they know whether to change their tactics or not. The weak points on the Colossus and the spray that occurs when they're damaged is more than enough visual feedback for a player to know whether they're on the right track. The player's own health bar is perhaps unnecessary as well, since there's a very small risk of dying in the game. In fact, due to low fall damage, it's entirely possible that the average number of deaths in Shadow of the Colossus is far lower than that of Eco, where falls could often be fatal. This seems counterintuitive. After all, the Wanderer is regularly put into more risky situations than Eco ever was. Had death been made an all or nothing affair and had the controls for the inventory been tweaked a little, it's entirely possible the only remaining element of a HUD would be the grip gauge. Even that could possibly have been represented by audio cues or some other visual element instead. Of course, changing the way death works would alter the game immensely, perhaps too much in order to remove a simple UI element. And a low number of deaths may have been an intentional design choice to improve player immersion as it seemed to be in Eco. It seems there's no easy solution to this problem. The heads-up display of Shadow of the Colossus would hardly be worth so much discussion in most other games. It would be a stretch to say it's obnoxious, especially compared to many of the game's contemporaries. That said, Team Eco had rightfully built a reputation for crafting entrancing visuals, and anything superimposed onto their game worlds is bound to be detrimental to their artistic vision. Thankfully, the HUD is usually off-screen and less necessary, which gives the brilliant visuals more room to shine. Stylistically, it's similar to Eco, but greatly expanded in its scope, particularly when it comes to the environments. Thanks to its vast amounts of empty space and wide open scenery, pre-positioned camera angles would be a poor way to represent the action. Shadow of the Colossus has a freely controlled third-person camera, but the team have clearly taken steps to ensure that it contributes to the visuals as much as possible. When riding Agro, for example, the viewpoint will usually be positioned so as to push the protagonist over to the side of the screen. This gives the player a better sense of the landscape which lies before them, and generally results in a better image than blandly placing the subject in the centre of the frame. This is also present when running around on foot, although usually to a lesser degree. During combat, players have the option of bringing the Colossus into focus simply by holding a button. In this case, the camera usually pulls down towards the Wanderer's feet and looks upwards at the Colossus, giving a better sense of their scale compared to the protagonist. A camera in a game can't simply be used to enhance the visuals on display, however. It also needs to be used for the player's navigation, and thankfully the camera in Shadow of the Colossus strikes a very nice balance between the two. A large part of this could be attributed to the lack of confined spaces, giving very few obstacles for the camera to become stuck on. The environments themselves, while vast, are often devoid of interesting terrain or objects. That isn't to say they don't exist, just that they're spaced very far apart. Most notable of all, however, is the lack of enemies out in the field. If Fumito Ueda has a trademark as a director, that trademark would be minimalism. Even the game's core concept conforms to that style. You can practically hear the question that Ueda posed himself at some point during development. What if a game had no regular enemies and the combat consisted entirely of boss fights? Of course, this raises the question of whether or not the Colossi encounters could even be considered boss fights since there's nothing to compare them against, but that's really a semantics issue. In any other game, any of the fights in Shadow of the Colossus could serve as a climactic moment at the end of a mission or level. This unique setup is what gives Shadow of the Colossus a natural pacing which plays itself out 16 times. Much the same way Eco had indoor and outdoor segments which felt quite different to one another, Shadow of the Colossus has fighting sections and horseback sections which contrast well with one another. Colossus fights are intense, loud and frantic, whereas riding Agro is relaxed, quiet and slow paced. Neither of these experiences exists in a vacuum, they're two sides of the same coin. If Shadow of the Colossus had been 16 boss fights back to back with nothing in between, then player fatigue would set in long before the end. Likewise, if the game had been nothing but riding around on horseback towards various locations, then that too would lose its charm quite quickly for most players. It's the constant switching back and forth that allows players to appreciate both for what they are. The importance of Agro in particular should not be understated. It's easy to forget that the horseback sections take up such a large percentage of playtime. Several pieces of technology come together to make these sections a seamless experience. Once the game starts up, it features almost no load times, the main exception being after each Colossus kill. Even then, those load times are necessary since the character teleports back to the temple, a dramatic and abrupt change in scenery which is too large to be loaded in the background. These load times are cleverly disguised with a short, ambiguous scene to keep the player immersed in the experience. Creating a wide open map posed many problems for the team, not least of which was the lighting. Shadow of the Colossus uses a dynamic tone mapping technique which changes the brightness in certain locations to mimic the behaviour of the human eye. This is most noticeable when transitioning from dark indoor scenes to outdoor spaces where the light will appear blinding at first but gradually settle over time. This required the level designers to box out each area of the game according to its general brightness, so the engine could blend from one brightness level to the other appropriately. In a huge outdoor world, this would have been a painstaking solution to have to set up and test, but the end result is a visual effect which wouldn't see widespread use until the following generation of consoles. The techniques used to display shadows were equally as advanced. Shadow of the Colossus is one of the only PlayStation 2 games to support self-shadowing, where a character can cast a shadow on their own body. This ambition, which makes Shadow of the Colossus one of the most technically impressive games to be built for the PS2, hasn't gone unpunished. The PS2 version saw somewhat unfortunate frame rate dips. The dips are at their worst when the camera pans around, so they are masked somewhat by the strong motion blur which is tied to the camera, but it remains a disappointing issue nonetheless. The frame rate is the biggest improvement in the newer version, but unfortunately the team seem not to have accounted for the increased resolution when it comes to the draw distance, meaning some unfortunate pop-in can hamper immersion. This is particularly noticeable near the bridge, where the columns end up looking transparent a lot of the time. Although some hiccups in the visuals can be disappointing, the list of impressive technology really does go on and on. The fur on the Colossi, which interestingly had to be done with overlapping textures rather than a shader, is particularly noticeable. There's a dynamic animation system in place when the Wanderer climbs, and these improvements all exist on top of technology carried over from Eco, such as bloom lighting, cloth dynamics, and companion AI in the form of Agro. Traditionally, a method of transport like a horse would work in a very simple and pragmatic way in most games. The player would simply take control of the horse. Their movement options would be changed somewhat, but ultimately they would be in charge of everything the horse does. Shadow of the Colossus puts players in control of the Wanderer, controlling Agro, which is a very key distinction. Agro will naturally steer himself away from obstacles and cliffs, and his response time to the reins is realistic. This provides the player with less immediate control, but results in a subtly more immersive experience. For Ueda, this decision sounds obvious, which might be an insight into what differentiates him from other developers. Instead of thinking of Agro as a mode of transport, he first thought about him as a horse, and went from there. It helped, of course, that Ueda had a team willing and capable of taking on these unique demands. Nothing would be more demanding than the Colossi themselves, placed into an already densely packed engine. In particular, this required a complicated way of tracking collisions between the player and the Colossus. Most games will approximate the collisions on every entity in the game using either simple shapes like spheres and cuboids, or at best a low polygon version of the character model itself. Had they done the same thing in Shadow of the Colossus, then the Wanderer's movements on top of the Colossi would look very unnatural. At worst, he would float in the air or clip inside a Colossus. As such, the Colossi needed to have collision meshes which matched almost exactly with their character models, and each polygon on the mesh would need to move in time with the animations. This technique allowed the animators a lot more freedom than they would have had otherwise. This leaves the player with a lot of grappling points and areas to crawl around on, which is both a good and bad thing. The upside is it makes the climbing a more complex and less rigidly linear experience than it would have been otherwise. But the downside is players can get stuck in awkward areas where the collision mesh throws the Wanderer around continually, hampering movement. This can end up seeming unfortunately random, as areas which are quite close together can spark very different results in the Wanderer's movements as he moves from one polygon to the next. Seeing the character be thrown around while desperately hanging onto the head of a Colossus certainly makes the fights more interesting, but having him struggle to climb or walk on areas which barely seem to be moving can be quite frustrating. It took a strong combination of great character design, animation and artificial intelligence to bring each Colossus to life. Of course, when a game revolves entirely around 16 boss fights, that means every care can be taken to ensure they turn out well. This was one of the principles guiding the team during the game's construction. While there's a certain amount of repetition in the roster of Colossi, there's no denying the team pushed the concept in many different directions. Most play out like puzzles before the climbing section begins. Some take place in the sky, while others reside underwater or underground. Even the size of the Colossi can change drastically from one fight to the next, with the size difference between the smallest and the largest being absolutely immense. The arrangement of the Colossi is not unlike the track listing on an album. The director needed to ensure that a certain ebb and flow would keep players engaged. This is one aspect of the game's design which could be debated endlessly. With 16 Colossi, there's 20 trillion possible orders they could have been arranged in. Some of the placements are obvious, such as the first simple Colossus or the final climactic one. The rationale behind the others seems to have been to create a sense of unpredictability. For example, the airborne Colossi take up the 5th and 13th positions, quite far apart from one another, but the small Colossi occupy the 11th and 14th positions, quite close together and also nearer to the end, when one would expect the Colossi to get bigger rather than smaller. The use of Agro during battles illustrates this as well. The battles where he's available are spread fairly evenly throughout the whole game, except for 2 which happen back to back on the 9th and 10th Colossi, again creating an unpredictable flow to the experience. This leads players to wonder what exactly it is they'll be going up against next, creating both a sense of curiosity and dread. Each fight is a little different from the last, but this isn't thanks to any growth on behalf of the Wanderer. Differences in each encounter are accomplished by the varied environments as well as the behaviour and shape of the Colossi. The player has access to all the same tools at the start of the game as they do at the end. This establishes a common set of mechanics they can use to tackle each Colossus, reducing the amount of hand-holding the game has to do, and thus allowing the player the satisfaction of naturally arriving at a solution. Unfortunately, this is undermined by Dorman, who will chime in to provide a hint after a certain amount of time. Being told what to do so directly can rob a player of any sense of accomplishment, and worse still, there's no way to turn these messages off. This solution to players getting stuck at least feels consistent with the world that has been established, but at times it can backfire atrociously. If a player still can't figure out what's wrong, or can't execute it correctly, then Dorman will continue to repeat the same advice periodically. Instead of helping a player in that scenario, the game will often become more aggravating than it would have been otherwise. Frustration can be a problem in any game. There's no way to ensure that every player will be able to have a smooth experience 100% of the time in anything, but it can be particularly detrimental to Shadow of the Colossus. Once overcome, frustration leads into relief, which is probably an intended emotion for the player to experience after killing some Colossi, but not all. Several of the Colossi are docile, some could easily be described as majestic. The act of killing them isn't always supposed to feel triumphant. The music which plays after the fatal blow hardly sounds congratulatory. Thankfully, with 16 different bosses, it's almost guaranteed that the intended emotional impact of these scenes will be felt at least a few times by each player. Although the story of Shadow of the Colossus is practically non-existent outside the start and the ending, the events of the game themselves can become a sort of emotional roller coaster for the player. This is going to be different for every person and every fight, but just for example, let's examine the 11th Colossus. To begin with, Dorman tells the player a little bit about the next encounter, which might spark some curiosity. It says the Colossus is a guardian of the place it resides. The player gets on Agro and makes their way across the Forbidden Land for several minutes in silence. This is a calming experience. Once the player arrives, they find the smallest Colossus so far, which ironically turns out to be more intimidating than many of the others, thanks to its aggressive nature and fast movement speed. This is tense and might make the player feel some fear. Once the player works out what to do, they'll use a torch to scare the Colossus off the cliff. As it backs towards the cliff, it looks pathetic, even sometimes making a weak attempt to paw at the player. This might invoke pity. Lastly, the player leaps onto the Colossus and eventually kills it. Depending on how much trouble they have with this, they might feel triumph, or they might feel guilt at having trespassed into this Guardian's area and murdered it. The black tendrils swoop out of the Colossus, and despite the player getting a chance to run away, they inevitably impact on the Wanderer. The player has experienced this many times now and might be feeling a sense of hopelessness for the protagonist. This is further reinforced when the Wanderer is teleported back to the shrine and several shadows stand over him while he lies unconscious, giving off a strong sense of foreboding. Once the statue implodes, Dorman tells the player about the next Colossus and the cycle begins again. The ending sequences also see some specific scenes which are bound to provoke a reaction from the player. Agro's apparent death being the first and most powerful for some. This scene at the end where the player controls Dorman can prove frustrating and thought-provoking as a result. After having killed 16 Colossi, it seems only fair that the player be allowed to experience the other side of that battle, and see that the odds were stacked in their favour all along. The climax of the game might very well be the moment where the Wanderer is pulled away from Mono. The entire objective of the game has been her resurrection, and in the end we're forced not only to see the Wanderer desperately struggle to get back to her and fail, but to actually live it out ourselves. While these set pieces are well constructed, the real key factor in their success, besides their fatalistic interactivity, is the way the game builds up to them. Affection for Agro is slowly accumulated over the course of several hours riding around on him, and he proves to be a key component to killing several Colossi which would have otherwise been impossible for the Wanderer to complete solo. Perhaps the most ingenious and well executed part of the entire game is the deterioration of the Wanderer himself after each kill. As the game progresses, he becomes more and more tattered, dirty and sickly in appearance. This is one of those obvious in retrospect touches that Ueda is masterful at. Even though we're given almost no backstory whatsoever on the Wanderer, we can sympathise with him, not only because we control him, but because of his sheer determination. Even when played flawlessly, his animations convey a genuine sense of struggle to complete his task, and he continues his task to the end, even though he seems to only suffer more and more as the events carry on. As a result, we can only assume the resurrection of Mono must be extremely important to him, and as such we want to see him succeed. The central thematic element which binds the three main characters is sacrifice. Mono is dead for that very reason, one of the only unnecessary details given to the player at the start. The Wanderer agrees at the start to pay the price, and by the end of the game he struggles to stand, having sacrificed himself to complete his goal. Lastly, there's the Colossi themselves. They're most likely part of Dorman, but are also sentient creatures in and of themselves. Most of them show at least some signs of self-preservation by trying to protect themselves or shake the protagonist off, making them sacrifices as well. Even Agro is seemingly killed towards the end of the game, but not before selflessly booking the Wanderer to safety. This theme of sacrifice speaks to the heart of most computer games ever made, which usually see a protagonist risking life and limb in the pursuit of some goal, often more for the sake of others than for themselves. Shadow of the Colossus takes a concept which had been used over and over again, but in its execution stresses the consequences in a way which had never been accomplished before. An atmosphere of isolation pervades the entire game, which also assists with making the protagonist more sympathetic. There's not only no enemies in the Forbidden Land, there's no people. The only person the Wanderer speaks to in the entire game is Dorman. Agro is even the only large animal the player can come across on their first playthrough, the rest being birds or lizards which often skitter or fly away when the player gets close. Even the beams of light in the sky which mark the dead Colossi seem like a reminder that the number of creatures in the Forbidden Land is dwindling, making the experience even lonelier as it progresses. The story is also intentionally left barren, and the main reason for this is probably to make it easier for the player to relate to the protagonist. The backstory can be filled in whatever way the player prefers. Most players will see a romantic relationship between the Wanderer and the girl, but this is never explicitly confirmed. Even when Agro appears at the end of the game, it's not clear whether she already knows him or not. She could just as easily be the Wanderer's sister, a friend, or someone he never even knew at all in life. One interesting fan theory places the Wanderer as Mono's killer during the ritual where she was sacrificed. Overcome with guilt, he sets out to make things right. All of these explanations are equally valid, and players are likely to see whichever one will resonate most with them. This extends to the other characters as well. It's clear that the Wanderer has entered into the middle of some kind of conflict between Dorman and the Shaman, but we're never given enough information to know who to root for. On the surface, Dorman would appear to be evil, but there's been a clear attempt to make them more ambiguous than such a simple label. At the start, they explicitly warn the Wanderer that he'll pay a steep price for carrying out his task, which seems like an awfully fair thing for a supposedly evil being to do. Furthermore, Dorman seems to fulfill their part of the arrangement at the end by reviving Mono, even though the Wanderer poses no threat to them at that point. The main arguments against Dorman are that it looks evil. After all, it has big scary horns and it was sealed away, so it must be. It's ironic that the most damning things against Dorman are the same things which seem not to matter at all when playing as Eco. Considering how vaguely much of the story is presented, it's hard to say definitively what exactly Ueda was hoping to achieve with some of the symbolism in the game, or if some of it was even intentional at all. Some seem more likely to be intentional than others. For example, the Wanderer getting stabbed through the symbol on his cloak is tragically ironic. Other facets of the world are so subtle that they might easily go unnoticed even after several playthroughs. For example, it's obvious that a new shadow appears standing over the Wanderer after each kill, but less noticeable is a new dove which appears next to the altar as well. Do these symbolise hope? Are they a different aspect of Dorman? Or are they just some nice little touch left in by a programmer? Nobody can say for sure. There are so many other details which warrant speculation that the game continues to be talked about long after its release. The sun can never directly be seen in the Forbidden Lands, which may hold some kind of significance, or may simply be a way of getting around some lighting limitations. The female aspect of Dorman's voice disappears in the final scenes for no apparent reason, leaving nothing but speculation as to what significance it holds. Some fans are even convinced that the shoreline of Eco can be seen at the edges of the Forbidden Lands, placing the events of both games in the same location. That Shadow of the Colossus can inspire such curiosity about such minor details is a testament to its enigmatic form of world building, which thankfully doesn't come at the cost of a satisfying conclusion. The story remains true to itself, punishing the Wanderer as was foretold at the very beginning. It's a tragedy, as it seemed it was always going to be, but ultimately a bittersweet one. Shadow of the Colossus carries the torch of Eco's minimalism in some ways, but not all, and while it lacks the pinpoint focus of Eco, it's arguably a better game as a result. While Eco requires a very specific mindset to enjoy, one which doesn't require complex or unique gameplay mechanics, Shadow of the Colossus is a much easier game to appreciate because it works on 2 levels instead of 1. Shadow of the Colossus isn't just an emotional experience for the player to go through, it's also an incredibly satisfying game independently of that. Jumping onto an enormous bird as it soars over a lake before crawling around on it and stabbing it to death isn't a moment likely to be forgotten by anyone, whether they enjoy the story or not. I believe that this is one of the main reasons why Shadow of the Colossus is considered by many, including myself, to be one of the greatest games they've ever played. Those who enjoyed the heavy, isolated atmosphere of Eco are unlikely to be disappointed, but the same goes for anyone simply looking for some good action. If you can enjoy both of these aspects, then Shadow of the Colossus elevates itself to heights most other games could only dream of.